For exactly 6,574 days, I carried a ghost in my chest, a secret so impossibly heavy that it threatened to crush the last remaining fragments of my sanity. If you have ever carried a silence so profound that it becomes a physical ache in your bones, if you have ever looked at the people you love most and swallowed the truth because you knew they would look at you with pity instead of understanding, you will know exactly why I kept my mouth shut for almost 2 decades. My name is George Theodore Brennan. I am 74 years old, and until the afternoon of October 12, 2024, I was entirely convinced that the human mind was simply a fragile machine, prone to breaking under the unbearable weight of grief. I thought the things I witnessed in a dimly lit room at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia 18 years ago were just the collateral damage of a broken heart. I was wrong about everything. The world sees me as a man carved from stone, a stubborn relic of an era that time has mostly forgotten. I suppose I gave them every reason to believe that. For 35 years, I worked as a construction supervisor in New York. My hands calloused and scarred from wrestling with structural steel and concrete, shaping the skyline while trying to ignore the ruins inside my own head. Before that, I was a sergeant in the 101st Airborne Division. I served 3 combat tours in Vietnam between 1968 and 1971. I walked through the green hell of the A Shau Valley. I breathed in the ash and the cordite, and I came back with traumas that rooted themselves so deeply in my soul that decades of post-war therapy barely scratched the surface. My survival forged an exterior so tough that very few people ever saw the vulnerability underneath. My wife, Eleanor, was one of the few who could reach me. We were married for 42 years until her passing in 2019, and together we raised 2 beautiful children. We built a good life over the ashes of my youth, and eventually I became a grandfather to 5 wonderful kids who became the absolute light of my existence. But there was always Michael. He was my daughter Sarah's boy, and from the moment he could walk and talk, our connection defied ordinary explanation. He was my closest grandchild, a boy with an old soul and a bright, infectious laugh that could cut through the darkest of my moods. While other children were fascinated by superheroes in capes, Michael was mesmerized by my military past. He would sit on the living room rug for hours, carefully inspecting my old medals, running his small fingers over the faded ribbons, and demanding to hear stories about the brave soldiers of the Screaming Eagles. He loved to play soldier, marching around the backyard with a makeshift salute, proudly calling himself Sergeant Michael, reporting for duty to Grandpa George. What nobody else understood was that Michael was doing more than just playing. Through his innocent, wide-eyed fascination, he was actively healing me. He possessed this miraculous ability to take the darkest, most terrifying memories of Vietnam and reframe them through the lens of pure, uncorrupted heroism. The nightmares that used to wake me up in a cold sweat, the shadows of the jungle that still haunted the corners of my vision, they somehow lost their power when Michael looked at me with absolute awe. To him, I was not a broken man carrying the unspeakable guilt of a war that tore a generation apart. To him, I was a hero. He was the only person in the world who could make me laugh about the past, transforming my pain into grand adventures of courage and brotherhood. Then came September of 2006. If you have ever felt the temperature drop in a room right before your entire life shatters, you know the exact chill that settled over our family that month. It started so quietly that we almost ignored it. Michael was 9 years old, a bundle of perpetual energy, but suddenly he was tired all the time. He developed a low-grade fever that simply refused to break. He lost his appetite, leaving his favorite meals untouched on the dinner plate. We thought it was just a stubborn flu, the kind of seasonal bug that kids catch when they go back to school. But the fatigue deepened, turning his usually rosy cheeks a frightening shade of pale. Then came the nosebleeds, sudden and heavy, ruining his shirts while he was just sitting on the couch. A few days later, Sarah noticed the bruises. inexplicable purple and yellow marks blooming across his small legs and arms like ink stains on paper. I remember the exact tone of Sarah's voice when she called me from the pediatrician's office. It was a pitch of terror I had not heard since the radio chatter during an ambush in the jungle. The doctor had taken one look at Michael's skin, ordered urgent blood tests, and immediately sent them to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I left my construction site in Manhattan, leaving the steel beams hanging in midair, and drove down the turnpike with a suffocating knot in my throat. The diagnosis hit us like an artillery shell, leveling our family to the ground. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. It is an aggressive, fast-moving cancer of the blood and bone marrow that primarily strikes children. The oncologists, with their tired eyes and practiced sympathetic voices, sat us down in a small, windowless conference room and explained the battlefield. Michael needed immediate, intensive chemotherapy. His white blood cell count was catastrophic. The disease was in an advanced stage, moving with a ruthless velocity that left the medical team scrambling to catch up. They spoke of protocols, remission rates, and bone marrow aspirations, but all I could hear was the ticking clock of my grandson's mortality. Even with the most aggressive treatment, they told us, his chances of survival were uncertain. Over the next 3 weeks, that hospital became my entire universe. I practically moved into the pediatric oncology ward, taking turns with Sarah, so that Michael would never, for a single second, open his eyes and find himself alone. I am a veteran of a brutal war. I have held dying men. I have navigated through chaos and carnage, and I truly believed that my military stoicism would give me the emotional armor necessary to be the rock my family needed during this crisis. I thought I could compartmentalize the fear, lock it away in the same mental vault where I kept the ghosts of 1970. I was profoundly wrong. Watching a 9-year-old child endure extreme physical agony breaks a man in ways that bullets and shrapnel never could. I watched nurses inject toxic chemicals into his fragile veins. I watched his thick, beautiful hair fall out in clumps onto the sterile white pillowcase. I watched him vomit until there was nothing left but bile and dry heaves, his small body trembling in my arms. Seeing him confront the gradual, inescapable reality of his own impending death dismantled every psychological defense I had spent 35 years building. The therapy, the stoicism, the tough New York exterior, it all crumbled into dust beside that hospital bed. Yet, in the midst of that unimaginable suffering, Michael displayed a courage that absolutely defied his age. He faced the leukemia with a bravery that immediately brought to mind the finest soldiers I had ever served with in the 101st Airborne. He never complained about the pain. When the needles pierced his skin, he would bite his lip, look into my eyes, and give me a tiny, trembling nod, as if to say he was holding the line. When Sarah would break down crying, burying her face in her hands, it was Michael, pale and frail, who would reach out and stroke her hair, whispering that it was going to be okay. He maintained an unbreakable hope that he would win the battle, constantly comparing his treatments to military campaigns. He would talk about fighting the bad cells like we were discussing tactical maneuvers against an enemy force. His immense bravery was the most inspiring thing I had ever witnessed, and at the same time, it was tearing my heart into unrecoverable shreds. The turning point came on the night of October 11th, bleeding into the early hours of October 12th. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere in the ward told me everything before the doctors even opened their mouths. The primary oncologist pulled Sarah and me out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long, hollow shadows on the linoleum floor. Michael's body was failing. The leukemia cells had overwhelmed his system, multiplying so rapidly that his blood was no longer his own. His organs were shutting down, cascading into failure one by one. The chemotherapy had done nothing but poison a body already losing its war. The doctor looked at the floor, then at us, and said the words that still echo in my nightmares. "There is nothing more we can do medically. He has entered the terminal phase. It is just a matter of hours now, We will keep him comfortable with morphine." Sarah collapsed into my arms, her weeping echoing down the quiet hospital corridor, a sound of absolute, primal despair. I held her, staring blankly at the wall, feeling a cold numbness spread from my chest out to my fingertips. I was losing my boy, my little sergeant, and all the strength in the world could not stop it. I spent that entire night sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair right beside Michael's bed. The room was dark, illuminated only by the rhythmic, mechanical blinking of the monitors, tracking his fading heartbeat, and the steady drip of the morphine pump. I held his small, unnaturally cold hand in my large, rough ones. I leaned in close to his ear, my voice cracking, and I did the only thing I knew how to do. I told him stories. I told him about the bravest men I had ever known, men who faced impossible odds in the jungle, men who never surrendered their honor even when the night was at its darkest. Michael drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow and labored, but whenever he opened his eyes, they were bright and attentive. Even as he stood on the threshold of death, he would occasionally squeeze my fingers and ask a weak, whispered question about a military tactic or the weight of a rucksack. He was holding on to our tradition, demanding heroism to the very last breath. The digital clock on the wall shifted its red numbers in the silence. It was around 4 in the morning on October 12th. The hospital was completely still, wrapped in that deep, hollow quiet that only exists in the hours right before dawn. Michael had been asleep, his chest rising and falling with a terrifying fragility. Suddenly, his breathing pattern changed. His eyes fluttered open, not glazed with the haze of the heavy narcotics, but sharp, clear, and intensely focused. He slowly turned his head, looking past me, staring directly into the empty, dimly lit corner of the hospital room. "Grandpa George," he whispered, his voice incredibly faint but completely lucid. "There is a soldier here." My heart skipped a beat. I immediately turned around, my eyes scanning the small room, expecting to see a night nurse or an orderly who had slipped in unnoticed. But the room was entirely empty. The corner he was staring at held nothing but a spare chair and a shadow cast by the medical equipment. "Where, Michael?" I asked softly, smoothing his damp forehead, assuming the morphine was finally manifesting as hallucinations. "Right there," he said, lifting a trembling finger to point specifically at the empty space between the chair and the window. "He is a young soldier. He looks like he is about the same age as Cousin Danny, maybe 15. He is wearing a different kind of uniform. It looks modern. But Grandpa, he has the exact same medals as you, and he is smiling at me." A sudden, violent shiver ran down my spine, cold as ice water. I stared at Michael, trying to process his words. Yes, Michael knew about military uniforms because of our endless talks and history books, but he had never seen the specific physical medals I kept locked in a cedar box in my closet. Those medals were specific to the 101st Airborne Division and the distinct commendations of my service in Vietnam. I had never shown them to him because they carried too much blood and sorrow. There was absolutely no way he could conjure the exact image of those specific decorations in a drug-induced dream. "What is he doing, Michael?" I asked, my voice trembling, caught between the rational instinct to soothe a dying child's delirium and an inexplicable, heavy sensation that the air in the room had fundamentally changed. "He is explaining my special mission to me," Michael replied, his tone adopting that serious, formal military cadence he used when we played our games. "He said that every brave soldier gets assigned different types of missions. Some soldiers fight in regular wars on Earth, in jungles and deserts. But other soldiers, they have to fight against diseases. And when a soldier completes their earthly mission, they do not just go away. They get a promotion. They get assigned to a celestial mission." I had to grip the metal railing of the bed to steady myself. The hair on my arms stood up. His words were echoing the exact philosophies we had discussed about military hierarchy, about promotions being based on merit, sacrifice, and the courage demonstrated under heavy fire. But the way he was phrasing it, the vocabulary he was using, It did not sound like a 9-year-old boy. It sounded like someone was translating profound spiritual concepts into a language my grandson would perfectly understand and accept without fear. Did he say anything else? Did he tell you his name? I asked, my rational mind fighting a losing battle against the terrifying, beautiful certainty in Michael's eyes. He said his name is— It is a little hard to pronounce, Michael whispered, his brow furrowing slightly as he listened to the empty corner. Carlo? Yes, Carlo. He said he died being a soldier of God when he was exactly 15 years old. He told me that when young soldiers die while doing their duty, they get turned into special angels. Their new job is to help other child soldiers during their own final missions, so nobody has to cross enemy lines alone. I sat there utterly paralyzed. I mentally searched every conversation we had ever had, every book we had read, every movie we had watched. Michael had never heard of anyone named Carlo. It was not a name in our family, not a name in his school, not a character in his stories. Furthermore, the concept of a soldier of God was not the terminology we used. I was a lapsed Catholic who had not set foot in a church since a chaplain gave last rites to my friends in the mud of the Aishau Valley. We talked about infantrymen, paratroopers, and sergeants, never about soldiers of God. Michael, are you sure? Can you see him clearly right now? I asked, leaning closer, desperately trying to see whatever he was seeing. Yes, Grandpa, I see him perfectly, Michael answered, a weak, beautiful smile touching his pale lips. He has dark, curly hair. He is wearing jeans and modern sneakers with his uniform, which is funny for a soldier. And he is carrying something under his arm. It looks like a military computer, a laptop. But the coolest part, Grandpa, is that there is a light all around him. It is like he is decorated with metals made of pure light, and they are shining in the dark. For the next 2 hours, as the hospital slowly began to wake up outside our closed door, I sat in stunned silence as Michael carried on a detailed, hushed conversation with this invisible presence. He was not talking to me anymore. He was receiving a briefing. He would listen intently, nod his head, and occasionally repeat phrases back, reporting instructions about the protocol for transition to celestial duty and the standard operating procedures for soldiers promoted to angel service. The detail, the coherence, the logical progression of his responses, it was entirely too structured, too profoundly detailed to be the random firing of a dying brain flooded with narcotics. Delirium is chaotic. It loops and fragments. This was a structured, calming dialogue. At exactly 6:45 in the morning, the weak morning sunlight began to filter through the blinds, painting pale stripes across the hospital blanket. Michael's breathing had become incredibly shallow, the pauses between his breaths stretching longer and longer. He slowly turned his head away from the corner and looked directly into my eyes. His gaze was entirely clear, stripped of any pain or fear. "Grandpa George," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath of air. "Carlo said that my mission on Earth is complete. He said I fought with honor against the leukemia. I showed courage under heavy enemy fire. And now the commander is giving me a promotion for special operations in the sky. Carlo is going to escort me during the transfer, so you do not have to worry. I will not be scared. I have a guide." "Michael, my brave boy," I choked out, the tears finally breaking through my defenses, streaming down my weathered face, falling onto the sheets. I pressed my forehead against his hand, sobbing with a helpless, crushing agony. "Grandpa, wait," Michael said, his voice suddenly carrying an urgent, deliberate weight that made me look up. "Carlo told me I have to tell you something important before I go. He said you have to listen carefully." I wiped my eyes, nodding frantically. "I am listening, buddy. I am listening. Carlo said to tell you that you did not fail as a soldier in Vietnam. He said to tell you about Tommy Patterson." The blood in my veins turned instantly to ice. The hospital room, the machines, the morning light, everything seemed to stop entirely. I stopped breathing. He said you did not fail when you could not save Tommy, Michael continued, his voice fading but his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that pierced my soul. Carlo said Tommy is perfectly fine. He said Tommy is working with him on special missions now, and he told me to order you, as your commanding officer today, to stop carrying the survivor's guilt. He said 38 years is too long to carry that heavy rucksack. Drop it, Grandpa. Tommy forgives you. I felt like the floor had opened up and swallowed me. Tommy Patterson was a 19-year-old kid from Ohio, my squad mate, my brother in arms. In the spring of 1970, during a vicious Viet Cong ambush in deep foliage, Tommy was hit by shrapnel. I dragged him behind a fallen tree, pressing my hands into his torn chest, screaming for a medic that could not reach us through the crossfire. Tommy died looking up at me, choking on his own blood, while I desperately told him to hold on. I had never, not once in 36 years, spoken his name out loud. I never told Eleanor. I never told Sarah. I never told the VA psychiatrists. I buried Tommy Patterson in the deepest, darkest vault of my mind, punishing myself every single day of my life for not being fast enough, smart enough, or brave enough to save him. There was absolutely, categorically no possible way my 9-year-old grandson could know the name Tommy Patterson, let alone the exact nature of the guilt that had been quietly eating me alive for almost 4 decades. And he said one more thing, Michael whispered, his eyes slowly starting to close, a look of profound, beautiful peace settling over his features. He said you are going to live for exactly 18 more years after I die. And on the exact day of the 18th anniversary, he is going to come see you. He said he will find you on the park bench where you are going to go cry by yourself every afternoon. And when he sits next to you, he is going to tell you the rest of the story about today. The parts you need to know to finally understand. Michael took one long, slow breath, a deep sigh that seemed to release every ounce of pain and sickness from his small frame. He closed his eyes serenely, the faint smile still lingering on his lips. The monitors beside the bed suddenly let out a long, flat, continuous tone. The green line went straight. It was exactly 7:12 in the morning. My beautiful, brave grandson was gone, escorted away from the battlefield by a 15-year-old soldier I could not see, leaving me alone in the deafening silence of a sterile hospital room. For the next 18 years, I carried the impossible weight of those final minutes alone. The grief of losing Michael was a physical amputation, a loss that reshaped the entire geometry of our family. Sarah was hollowed out, surviving only through the sheer force of a mother's enduring love for her remaining memories. We buried Michael with full honors, a small replica of my 101st Airborne pin tucked into the pocket of his suit. But alongside the crushing grief, I carried the bewildering, terrifying, and profoundly isolating secret of his final words. I tried, in those early months of desperate mourning, to tell people what had happened in that room. I tried to explain it to Sarah one evening when the house was too quiet, hoping it would bring her the same bizarre comfort it was trying to offer me. But she looked at me with red, exhausted eyes and gently shook her head. She told me it was just the beautiful, heartbreaking fantasy of a dying child who loved his grandfather too much, a coping mechanism built from our military games to help him face the end. I could see the pain in her face, the quiet plea for me not to make it harder by clinging to ghosts, so I never brought it up to her again. I tried talking to the doctors at the hospital when I went back to pick up Michael's remaining belongings. I sat with the head of pediatric oncology, a kind man who had seen too much sorrow, and I recounted the conversation about the 15-year-old boy named Carlo and the mention of Tommy Patterson. The doctor offered a sad, clinical smile, explaining the powerful effects of high-dose morphine combined with the brain's natural release of endorphins during the dying process. He said terminal lucidity often produces vivid, comforting hallucinations, constructed from fragmented memories and subconscious desires. I even sought out a military chaplain at the local VA clinic, hoping a man of both war and God could untangle the knots in my mind. We sat in a small office smelling of stale coffee, and I poured out the story. The chaplain patted my shoulder, quoting scripture about the peace that surpasses understanding, framing the entire event as a psychological defense mechanism, a spiritual metaphor my traumatized mind had co-created with my grandson to cushion the blow of his death. Every logical, rational explanation pointed to the exact same conclusion. The trauma of the war and the trauma of the hospital had merged, creating a vivid, shared delusion. I was a grieving grandfather and a broken veteran, projecting my own unresolved guilt onto the dying lips of an innocent boy. But none of the doctors, none of the psychiatrists, and none of the chaplains could explain Tommy Patterson. They could not explain how a 9-year-old boy, completely isolated in a pediatric ward, could pull the name of a dead 19-year-old soldier from the jungles of 1970 out of thin air. They could not explain the precise details of the medals, or the specific name Carlo, or the bizarre mention of a teenager with a military computer wearing modern sneakers. Because I had no one to talk to, I locked the secret away, just as I had done with my war memories. But I could not ignore the final prophecy Michael had delivered. He said I would go to a park bench to cry by myself every afternoon. And he was right. Riverside Park in Manhattan had always been our place. Before the sickness, Michael and I would walk down to the paths along the Hudson River. There was a specific wooden bench, weathered and gray, facing the water under the shade of a massive oak tree. We would sit there on autumn afternoons, feeding the ducks, watching the boats navigate the currents, and talking about history, honor, and courage. After Michael died, that bench became my sanctuary, my private, silent church. Every single afternoon for 18 years, regardless of the weather, I walked to that bench. I sat there in the blistering heat of July, and I sat there in the freezing snow of February. I would stare out at the gray water of the Hudson, remembering the exact sound of his laugh, the feel of his small hand in mine, and the terrifying, beautiful certainty in his eyes during his final moments. And every year, on October 12th, the exact anniversary of his death, the ritual became an unbearable weight. I would sit there for hours, weeping silently, a 70-something-year-old man in a worn canvas jacket, hiding my tears behind sunglasses, waiting for a sign, waiting for a 15-year-old soldier who never came. I grew older. My joints stiffened with arthritis, my hair turned completely white, and my heart slowed its rhythm. Eleanor passed away in 2019, leaving an immense void in our home, but even she never knew the full truth of what I waited for at the park. As the years ticked by, I began to accept that the rational world was right. I was just an old fool, clinging to the morphine-laced words of a dying child. The prophecy was nothing more than a heartbreaking coincidence of timing and grief. Then came the morning of October 12th, 2024. It was exactly 18 years to the day since Michael had closed his eyes in that hospital room. I woke up with an ache in my chest that felt heavier than usual. I went through my morning routine with mechanical precision. I drank my black coffee. I looked at the photograph of Michael in his little camouflage jacket that sat on the mantel, and I braced myself for the anniversary. The afternoon was crisp, the air carrying the sharp, cold edge of early autumn. The leaves in Riverside Park were turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson, falling slowly onto the paved walkways. I wore my old green field jacket, the one with the faded patches, and walked slowly down to the river. The park was relatively quiet, just a few joggers and people walking their dogs. I reached our bench under the oak tree. The wood was cold and damp. I sat down heavily, leaning my cane against the armrest, and I looked out at the water. The memories of that hospital room hit me with the force of a physical blow. The smell of the antiseptic, the sound of the monitors, the exact pitch of Michael's voice whispering about the soldier made of light. I pulled my collar up against the wind, lowered my head, and let the tears fall, grieving not just for the grandson I lost, but for the 18 years of solitary madness I had endured waiting for a ghost. I must have been crying for 20 minutes, completely lost in the past, when I felt the bench shift slightly. Someone had sat down on the far end of the wooden slats. Normally, New Yorkers respect the invisible boundaries of a park bench, especially when an old man is visibly grieving. I kept my head down, wiping my eyes roughly with the back of my hand, hoping whoever it was would take the hint and move along. But they did not move. Instead, a profound, unnatural stillness seemed to settle over the immediate area. The background noise of the city, the distant traffic on the West Side Highway, the barking of dogs, it all seemed to fade away, muffled as if someone had thrown a thick blanket over the world. I slowly turned my head to look at the intruder. Sitting about 3 feet away from me was a young man. He looked to be exactly 15 years old. He had a mop of dark, curly hair, completely unruly, falling slightly into his eyes. He was wearing blue jeans, a bright red polo shirt, and modern dark-colored sneakers with thick white soles. Resting casually on his lap was a black backpack, the kind a high school kid carries, but peeking out of the top flap was the metallic edge of a laptop computer. My breath caught in my throat. My heart began to hammer against my ribs with a violence that made me dizzy. I stared at his face. It was an ordinary face, yet it possessed a striking, luminous kindness, an expression of such deep, ancient peace that it completely contradicted his youth. He turned his head and met my gaze. His eyes were dark, warm, and incredibly familiar, though I had never seen him before in my life. He did not look like a ghost. He looked solid, real, breathing the crisp autumn air just like I was. But there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible radiance around him, like the glow of sunlight catching the edge of a prism. He smiled at me. It was the exact same smile Michael had described 18 years ago. "Hello, George," the boy said. His voice was completely normal, the casual, friendly tone of a teenager, yet it carried an acoustic clarity that resonated directly inside my chest. I opened my mouth, but my vocal cords were paralyzed. My hands gripped the edge of the wooden bench so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I know it has been a long wait. I know it has been a long wait," the boy repeated, his voice carrying the gentle cadence of a summer breeze, despite the biting October chill. He did not speak with the booming authority of an archangel, but rather with the quiet, absolute certainty of a friend who had simply arrived on time. I stared at his modern sneakers, the red fabric of his shirt, the metallic edge of the computer resting in his backpack, and then back up to his dark, curling hair. I wanted to ask him 1,000 questions. I wanted to demand answers from the universe, to scream at the sky for the 18 years of solitary madness I had endured, but my voice remained trapped beneath the sheer, impossible gravity of his presence. "Carlo," I finally whispered, the name scraping against my dry throat, sounding less like a question and more like a surrender. The boy smiled, a radiant expression that seemed to warm the damp, cold wood of the bench beneath me. "Yes, George. I told Michael I would find you right here on this exact day. I am sorry you had to carry the weight of that silence for so long. The world is a very loud place, and it is hard for people to understand the quiet things, the things that happen just across the border of what they can see. But you remembered. You held your post. You never abandoned the mission Michael gave you, even when you were absolutely certain you were losing your mind." "Why?" I choked out, the tears spilling over my weathered cheeks, falling freely into the collar of my old field jacket. "Why 18 years? Why did I have to sit here alone, watching my family age, burying my wife, carrying Tommy and Michael in the dark? Why did you not come sooner?" Carlo shifted slightly, resting his hand on the top of his backpack. His fingers tapped a gentle rhythm against the canvas. "Because you had a rearguard action to complete, Sergeant Brennan," he said, using my old rank with a profound, respectful sincerity. "If you had left the battlefield that morning in the hospital, your daughter Sarah would have been completely destroyed. She needed you to anchor her to the earth. Eleanor needed you to hold her hand when her own time came to cross over. You had to stay behind to protect the people you loved, to be the steady foundation while they navigated their own grief. That was your final earthly deployment. It was hard, and it was lonely. But you did not fail. You held the line for them just like you tried to hold it for Tommy in the valley. The mention of Tommy Patterson sent a warm, trembling wave through my chest, melting the glacial block of guilt that had resided there since 1970. I looked out at the Hudson River. The water seemed to have slowed its churning, the gray surface turning smooth and reflective like polished glass. The distant hum of Manhattan traffic had vanished entirely, replaced by a profound golden silence that wrapped around us like a heavy blanket. Tommy has been waiting a long time to thank you, Carlo continued, leaning forward slightly, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that pulled the breath from my lungs. He wants you to know that the medic would not have made a difference. He wants you to know that the last thing he felt on earth was not fear, but the warmth of his brother hugging him, trying to keep him safe. You did not let him die alone in the dark, George. You gave him courage. And that courage became his credential when he was promoted to his celestial mission. He and Michael are great friends now. They talk about you all the time. My chest heaved as I sobbed, a deep, primal release of 54 years of accumulated sorrow, trauma, and survivor guilt. I wept for the boy I was in the jungle, for the 19-year-old kid bleeding out in the mud, for the 9-year-old grandson who faced cancer with the heart of a lion, and for the old man I had become, sitting on a park bench waiting for a miracle. With every tear that fell, I felt a physical weight lifting from my bones, the chronic ache in my lower back, the stiffness in my arthritic fingers, the heavy, labored rhythm of my old heart. It was all beginning to dissolve, replaced by a strange, buoyant lightness. Michael sent you with the rest of the story, I said, my voice suddenly steady, clear, and devoid of the rasping age that had claimed it over the last decade. What is the rest of the story, Carlo? Carlo stood up from the bench. As he moved, the faint prismatic light surrounding him grew brighter, casting a warm, honey-colored glow across the fallen autumn leaves. He slung his backpack over one shoulder and looked down at me with an expression of infinite, brotherly compassion. The rest of the story is that the war is over, George, Carlo said softly. You have completed every mission assigned to you. You survived the jungle. You built a family from the ashes. You guarded your grandson through his final battle. And you stayed behind to protect the ones who were left. The commander has reviewed your service record. Your tour of duty on Earth is officially complete. He reached out his hand. It was not a ghostly apparition. It was a solid, warm hand, radiating an absolute, unshakable peace. Michael requested permission to be part of the welcoming detail, Carlo added, his smile widening into a grin that was pure, joyful youth. He is just on the other side of this park, standing with Tommy. They are both in full-dress uniform. Michael told me to tell you that he expects a proper salute when you see him. I looked at Carlo's outstretched hand, and then I looked down at myself. I realized, with a sense of quiet wonder, that I was no longer looking through the cloudy, failing eyes of a 74-year-old man. I turned my head and looked back at the wooden bench. Sitting there, leaning heavily against the armrest with his chin tucked into the collar of an old green field jacket, was the body of George Theodore Brennan. His eyes were closed, his face completely relaxed, bearing the peaceful expression of a man who had simply fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep while watching the river. I felt no fear. There was no panic, no desperate clinging to the fragile machinery of the human body I had occupied for over 7 decades. There was only a soaring, limitless freedom, a sensation of stepping out of a suffocating armor I had forgotten I was wearing. The air smelled of rain and blooming jasmine, displacing the cold bite of the New York autumn. I reached out and grasped Carlo's hand. His grip was firm and reassuring. As I stood up, the park around me began to shift. The gray clouds overhead dissolved into a brilliant, impossible sky of vibrant gold and deep violet. The paved walkway transformed into a bright, luminous path that stretched out toward a distant horizon where the light was so pure it sang. "Ready to go home, Sergeant?" Carlo asked, adjusting his backpack, the celestial light now fully illuminating the invisible metals of pure grace that adorned his red shirt. I stood tall, rolling my shoulders, feeling the strength of a young man coursing through my spirit. I looked down the luminous path, and in the distance I saw them. Two figures standing side by side in the golden light. One was a tall, lanky young man from Ohio, whole and unblemished. Beside him stood a 9-year-old boy standing perfectly at attention, a bright, infectious laugh echoing across the distance, calling out for his grandfather. I turned to the 15-year-old soldier of God standing beside me. I gave him a crisp, perfect nod. "Lead the way, Carlo," I said. Together we walked forward into the light, leaving the silence, the grief, and the ghosts behind forever. The light did not blind. It clarified. With every step I took alongside Carlo, the residual echoes of my earthly existence, the phantom ache of shrapnel in my knee, the bone-deep exhaustion of 74 years of gravity, the suffocating dust of falling steel and concrete, evaporated like morning mist under a rising sun. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer the scarred, trembling hands of an old man who had spent decades wrestling with grief. They were strong, steady, and unblemished. I was not a ghost. For the first time in over half a century, I was entirely, fundamentally alive. Ahead of us, the golden path widened into a vast, breathtaking expanse that felt simultaneously like the greenest meadow I had ever seen and the quietest sanctuary I had ever entered. The two figures waiting for me stepped out of the radiant haze. Tommy Patterson was exactly as I remembered him from the spring of 1970, yet stripped of the terror and the mud that had defined our last moment together. He wore crisp olive-drab fatigues, his posture straight, his blue eyes shining with a profound, eternal calm. He did not look like a boy who had died in agony. He looked like a soldier who had won the ultimate victory. As I closed the distance, Tommy snapped to attention. His hand rose in a perfect razor-sharp salute. He held it, his chin high, offering me the respect of a brother who knew exactly what it cost to survive. I stopped, my own hand rising to my brow, returning the salute with a trembling precision I had not mustered since my honorable discharge. When I finally lowered my arm, Tommy stepped forward and pulled me into an embrace that transcended time. There were no words needed for the forgiveness I had desperately craved for 38 years. It was already there, woven into the very fabric of this place. He clapped my shoulder, his grip strong and warm, anchoring my soul to its beautiful new reality. Then I looked down. Michael was standing right beside him, wearing a spotless, glowing replica of my old 101st Airborne uniform, complete with the screaming eagle patch on his shoulder. His cheeks were flush with vibrant health, his thick hair perfectly restored, his eyes dancing with that same old, infectious mischief. He planted his feet shoulder-width apart, puffed out his small chest, and threw up his hand in the crispest salute I had ever witnessed. Private First Class Michael, reporting for celestial duty. "Grandpa George," he announced, his voice ringing like a silver bell in the golden air. "The commander said you were finally coming to join our squad." I dropped to one knee, bringing myself eye level with the boy who had saved my mind long before he lost his own life. I did not salute him. Instead, I wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him. It was no longer the sterile, terrifying odor of the oncology ward, but the smell of autumn leaves, fresh rain, and pure, unadulterated joy. He hugged me back with a fierce, impossible strength, his small hands gripping the fabric of my jacket. I wept again, but this time they were tears of absolute, uncontainable triumph. The gaping, bleeding hole in my chest, the one I had carried for 18 years, sealed itself completely. I was finally whole. Carlo stepped up beside us, a gentle, knowing smile on his face. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and looked out over the boundless horizon of light. He explained, in a voice that resonated with the harmony of 1,000 distant choirs, that our next mission was not one of war, nor of suffering, but of guidance. We were to be the unseen hands that steadied the trembling, the quiet whispers of courage in the dark, the guardians of those who still walked the heavy, muddy trenches of the world below. It was an assignment of pure, unconditional love. Back in Riverside Park, beneath the sprawling, shadowed branches of the old oak tree, the cold October wind continued to blow off the Hudson River. A young woman, jogging along the paved path with her golden retriever, slowed her pace as she noticed the elderly man sitting on the weathered wooden bench. He was leaning back against the slats, his chin tucked warmly into the collar of his faded green field jacket, his hands resting peacefully in his lap. When she stepped closer to check on him, her breath caught in her throat. She expected to see the tragic, painful mask of a lonely death. Instead, she found a face illuminated by an expression of such profound, breathtaking serenity that it made her own heart ache with a strange, sudden comfort. He looked as though he were dreaming of the most beautiful place in the universe. She pulled her phone from her pocket to call for help, speaking softly into the receiver, unaware that she was standing on sacred ground. She could not see the brilliant, impossible sky that had opened up just beyond the veil of the autumn afternoon. She could not hear the joyous laughter of a grandfather and a grandson finally reunited, or the sharp, proud cadence of brothers in arms marching together once more. My name is George Theodore Brennan. For exactly 6,574 days, I carried a ghost in my chest. But as I stood up, holding my grandson's hand in mine, walking alongside Tommy and Carlo into the endless, radiant dawn of eternity, I finally understood the truth of my long, painful deployment. There are no ghosts. There is only love, waiting patiently at the end of the line, ready to welcome the weary soldiers home.